Hi Year 6, here's chapter 10 of Stormbreaker. Enjoy! Chapter 10, Death in the Long Grass. Alex was woken up by an indignant Nadia Vole knocking at his door. He had overslept. "This morning it is your last opportunity to experience the Stormbreaker," she said. "Right," Alex said. "This afternoon we begin to send the computers out to schools. Herr Sale has suggested that you take the afternoon for leisure. A walk, perhaps, into Port Talon. There is a footpath that goes through the fields and then by the sea. You will do that, yes?" "Yeah, I'd love that." "Good. And now I leave you to put on some clothing. I will come back for you in 10 minuten." Alex splashed cold water on his face before getting dressed. It had been 4 o'clock by the time he had got back to his room, and he was still quite tired. His night expedition hadn't been quite the success he'd hoped. He had seen so much: the submarine, the silver boxes, the death of the guard who had dared to drop one, and yet, in the end, he still hadn't learned anything. Was Yasin Grigorovich working for Herod Zell? He had no proof that Zell knew he was here. And what about the boxes? They could have contained packed lunches for staff of Sale Enterprises for all he knew. Except, you didn't kill a man for dropping a packed lunch. Today was the 31st of March. As Vole had said, the computers were on their way out. There was only 1 day to go until the ceremony at the Science Museum, but Alex had nothing to report, and the only piece of information that he had sent, Ian Ryder's diagram, had also drawn a blank. There had been a reply waiting for him on the bottom of the screen of his Nintendo when he turned it on before going to bed. Unable to recognise diagram or letters numbers. Possible map reference, but unable to source map. Please transmit further observations. Alex had thought of transmitting the fact that he had actually sighted Yasin Grigorovich, but he had decided against it. If Yasin was there, Mrs. Jones had promised to pull him out. And suddenly, Alex wanted to see this through to the end. Something was going on at Sale Enterprises, that much was obvious. And he'd never forgive himself if he didn't find out what it was. Nadia Vole came back for him as promised, and he spent the next 3 hours toying with the Stormbreaker. This time, he enjoyed himself less. And this time, he noticed, when he went to the door, a guard had been posted in the corridor outside. It seemed that Sale Enterprises wasn't taking any more chances where he was concerned. 1 o'clock arrived, and at last the guard released him from the room and escorted him as far as the main gate. It was a glorious afternoon, the sun shining as he walked out onto the road. He took a last look back. Mr. Grin had just come out of the buildings and was standing some distance away, talking into a mobile phone. There was something unnerving about the sight. Why should he be making a telephone call now? And who could possibly understand a word he said? It was only once he'd left the plant that Alex was able to relax. Away from the fences, the armed guards, and the strange sense of threat that pervaded Sale Enterprises, it was as if he was breathing fresh air for the first time in days. The Cornish countryside was beautiful, the rolling hills a lush green dotted with wildflowers. Alex found the footpath sign and turned off the road. He had worked out that Port Talon was a couple of miles away, a walk of less than an hour if the route wasn't too hilly. In fact, the path climbed upwards quite steeply almost at once, and suddenly Alex found himself perched over a clear, blue and sparkling English channel, following a track that zigzagged precariously along the edge of a cliff. To one side of him, fields stretched into the distance, their long grass bending in the breeze. To the other, there was a fall of at least 50 metres to the rocks and water below. Port Talon itself was at the very end of the cliffs, tucked in against the sea. It looked almost too quaint from here, like a model in a black and white Hollywood film. He came to a break in the path, a second, much rougher track leading away from the sea and across the fields. His instincts would have told him to go straight ahead, but a footpath sign pointed to the right. There was something strange about the sign. Alex hesitated for a moment, wondering what it was. Then he dismissed it. He was walking in the countryside, and the sun was shining. What could possibly be wrong? He followed the sign. The path continued for about another quarter of a mile, then dipped into a hollow. Here the grass was almost as tall as Alex, rising up all around him, a shimmering green cage. A bird suddenly erupted in front of him, a ball of brown feathers that spun round on itself before taking flight. Something had disturbed it. And that was when Alex heard the sound. An engine getting closer. A tractor? No, it was too high-pitched and moving too fast. Alex knew he was in danger, the same way an animal does. There was no need to ask why or how. Danger was simply there. And even as the dark shape appeared, crashing through the grass, he was throwing himself to one side, knowing, too late now, what it was that had been wrong about the second footpath sign. It had been brand new. The first sign, the one that had led him off the road, had been weather-beaten and old. Someone had deliberately led him away from the correct path and brought him here, to the killing field. He hit the ground and rolled into a ditch on one side. The vehicle burst through the grass, its front wheel almost touching his head. Alex caught a glimpse of a squat black thing with 4 flat tyres, a cross between a miniature tractor and a motorbike. It was being ridden by a hunched-up figure in grey leathers, with helmet and goggles. Then it was gone, thudding down into the grass on the other side of him and disappearing instantly, as if a curtain had been drawn. Alex scrambled to his feet and began to run. There were 2 of them. He knew what they were now. He'd ridden similar things himself on holiday in the sand dunes of Death Valley, Nevada. Kawasaki 4x4s, powered by 400cc engines with automatic transmission, quad bikes. They were circling him like wasps. A drone, then a scream, and the second bike was in front of him, roaring towards him, cutting a swathe through the grass. Alex hurled himself out of its path, once again crashing into the ground, almost dislocating his shoulder. Wind and engine fumes whipped across his face. He had to find somewhere to hide. But he was in the middle of a field, and there was nowhere apart from the grass itself. Desperately, he fought through it, the blade scratching at his face, half blinding him as he tried to find his way back to the main path. He needed other people. Whoever had sent these machines, and now he remembered Mr. Grin talking on his mobile phone, they couldn't kill him if there were witnesses around. But there was no one, and they were coming for him again, together this time. Alex could hear the engines, whining in unison, coming up fast behind him. Still running, he glanced over his shoulder and saw them, one on each side, seemingly about to overtake him. It was only the glint of the sun and the sight of the grass slicing itself in half that revealed the horrible truth. The 2 cyclists had stretched a length of cheese wire between them. Alex threw himself head first, landing flat on his stomach. The cheese wire whipped over him. If he had been standing up, it would have cut him in half. The quad bikes separated, arching away from each other. At least that meant they must have dropped the wire. Alex had twisted his knee in the last fall, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they cornered him and finished him off. Half limping, he ran forwards, searching for somewhere to hide or something to defend himself with. Apart from some money, he had nothing in his pockets, not even a penknife. The engines were distant now, but he knew they would be closing in again at any moment. And what would it be next time? More cheese wire? Or something worse? It was worse. Much worse. There was the roar of an engine, and then a billowing cloud of red fire exploded over the grass, blazing it to a crisp. Alex felt it singe his shoulders, yelled, and threw himself to one side. One of the riders was carrying a flamethrower. He had just aimed a bolt of fire 8 meters long, meaning to burn Alex alive. And he had almost succeeded. Alex was saved only by the narrow ditch he'd landed in. He hadn't even seen it until he had thudded to the ground, into the damp soil, the jet of flame licking at the air just above him. It had been close. There was a horrible smell. His own hair. The fire had singed the ends. Choking, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, he clambered out of the ditch and ran blindly forward. He had no idea where he was going anymore. He only knew that in a few seconds the quad would be back. He had taken about 10 paces before he realised he had reached the edge of the field. There was a warning sign and an electrified fence stretching as far as he could see. But for the buzzing sound the fence was making, he would have run right into it. The fence was almost invisible, and the quad bikers, moving fast towards him, would be unable to hear the warning sound over their engines. He stopped and turned around. About 50 metres away from him, the grass was being flattened by the still invisible quad as it made its next charge. But this time Alex waited. He stood there, balancing on the heels of his feet like a matador. 20 metres, 10. Now he was staring straight into the goggles of the rider, saw the man's uneven teeth as he smiled, still gripping the flamethrower. The quad smashed down the last barrier of grass and leapt onto him. Except Alex was no longer there. He had dived to one side and, too late, the driver saw the fence and rocketed on straight into it. The man screamed as the wire caught him around the neck, almost garrotting him. The bike twisted in mid-air, then crashed down. The man fell into the grass and lay still. He had torn the fence out of the ground. Alex ran over to the man and examined him. For a moment, he thought it might be Yasin, but it was a younger man, dark-haired, ugly. Alex had never seen him before. The man was unconscious, but still breathing. The flamethrower lay, extinguished, on the ground beside him. Behind him, he heard the other bike, some distance away, but closing. Whoever these people were, they had tried to run him down, cut him in half, and incinerate him. He had to find a way out before they got really serious. He ran over to the abandoned quad, which had come to rest lying on its side. He heaved it up again, jumped onto the seat and pressed the starter. The engine sprang into life. At least there were no gears to worry about. Alex twisted the accelerator and gripped the handlebars as the machine jolted him forward. And now he was slicing through the grass, which became a green blur as the quad carried him back towards the footpath. He couldn't hear the other bike, but hoped that the rider would have no idea what had happened and so wouldn't be following him. His bones rattled as the quad hit a rut and bounced upwards. He had to be careful, lose his concentration for a second, and he would be on his back. He cut through another green curtain and savagely pulled on the handlebars to bring himself round. He had found the footpath and also the edge of the cliff. Just 3 more metres, and he would have launched himself into space and down to the rocks below. For a few seconds, he sat where he was, the engine idling. That was when the other quad appeared. Somehow, the second rider must have guessed what had happened. He had reached the footpath and was facing Alex, about 200 metres away. Something glinted in his hand, resting on the handlebar. He was carrying a gun. Alex looked back the way he had walked. It was no good. The path was too narrow. By the time he had turned the quad round, the armed man would have reached him. One shot and it would all be over. Could he go back into the grass? No, for the same reason. He had to move forward, even if that meant heading for a straight-on collision with the other quad. Why not? Maybe there was no other way. The man gunned in his engine and spurted forward. Alex did the same. Now, the two of them were racing towards each other down a narrow path, a bank of earth and rocks suddenly rising up to form a barrier on one side and the edge of the cliff on the other. There wasn't enough room for them to pass. They could stop or they could crash. But if they were going to stop, they had to do it in the next 10 seconds. The quads were getting closer and closer, moving faster all the time. The man couldn't shoot him now, not without losing control. Far below, the waves glittered silver, breaking against the rocks. The edge of the cliff flashed by. The noise of the other quad filled Alex's ears. The wind rushed into him, hammering at his chest and face. It was like the old-fashioned game of chicken. One of them had to stop. One of them had to get out of the way. 3, 2, 1. It was the enemy who finally broke. He was less than 5 meters away, so close that Alex could make out the perspiration on his forehead. Just when it seemed that a crash was inevitable, he twisted his quad and swerved off of the path, up onto the embankment. At the same time, he tried to fire his gun, but he was too late. His quad was slanting, tipping over on just 2 of its wheels, and the shot went wild. The man yelled out. Firing the gun had caused him to lose what little control he had left. He fought with the quad, trying to bring it back onto 4 wheels. It hit a rock and bounced upwards, landing briefly on the footpath, then continued over the edge of the cliff. Alex had felt the machine rush past him, but he had seen little more than a blur. He had shuddered to a halt and turned around just in time to watch the other quad fly in the air. The man, still screaming, had managed to separate himself from the bike on the way down, but the 2 of them hit the water at the same moment. The quad sank a few seconds before the man. Who had sent him? It was Nadia Vole who had suggested the walk, but it was Mr. Grin who had actually seen him leave. Mr. Grin had given the order. He was sure of it. Alex took the quad all the way to the end of the path. The sun was still shining as he walked down into the little fishing village, but he couldn't enjoy it. He was angry with himself because he knew he'd made too many mistakes. He should have been dead now, he knew. Only luck and a low-voltage electric fence had managed to keep him alive.
Hope you enjoyed that, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for Chapter 11.